You're now using Module 3 of the People-Centered Screening and Assessment modules, focused on Childhood Experiences Survey. In this module, all participants who are home visiting professionals will be able to understand the context and purpose of conducting the Childhood Experiences Survey. They'll also be able to identify the correct screening protocol and pitfalls for grantees. It'll give participants an opportunity to understand and articulate the value of this survey for families and professionals, as well as provide some strategies for framing the Childhood Experiences Survey and processes to families effectively. Finally, it will be able to give folks an opportunity to use this survey with greater intention and effectiveness to strengthen home visiting services and individualized supports to families. There's also a portion of the module that's really focused to supervisors, and while it can be reviewed by home visitors as well, it's particularly important to supervisors in terms of considering tools and strategies to support home visitors in conducting the Childhood Experiences Survey as an integrated and effective part of home visiting services. As a reminder, at the end of this module, there is a copy of the Childhood Experiences Survey tip sheet. You can print this tip sheet off now or later, but it's available as a handy reference. This is a screenshot of the Childhood Experiences Survey developed by Drs. Mirsky and Topitzis. You can feel free to print out a copy of that now as well to have available for the module to make notes on, or you can print it out at the end as well. So here are some quick facts about the authors. The original research was done by Drs. Anda and Folletti with the Centers for Disease Control and Kaiser Permanente. Their goal was to develop information that would help draw connections between experiences that people have in childhood and long-term health implications related to behavioral, mental, and physical health. Drs. Joshua Mirsky and Dr. James Topitzis, in consultation with the Wisconsin Department of Children and Families, the Wisconsin Department of Health Services, and Wisconsin's Children's Trust Fund, adapted the ACE's work to create the Childhood Experiences Survey. This survey is what's being used with home visiting programs that are family foundations in Wisconsin. Drs. Mirsky and Topitzis' work on childhood experiences is designed to expand the ACE framework. The goal is to help home visiting professionals and the families they serve understand and respond to the connections between childhood adversity and adult functioning across socio-emotional, health-related, and economic domains. Building on the Adverse Childhood Experiences study that was conducted from 1995 to 1997 at Kaiser Permanente, the Centers for Disease Control developed an 11-question ACE survey that is included in the Centers for Disease Control Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System. An ACE study was replicated on a smaller scale in Wisconsin by the Children's Trust Fund and Children's Hospital based on 2010 data from the Behavioral Risk Survey. So the purpose of the Childhood Experiences Survey is to provide home visitors and families an opportunity to see the connections between the parents' adverse childhood experiences and their current family situations. In being able to draw those connections, it can help parents to create the family that they want. Insight about adverse childhood experiences and present circumstances may also uncover the parents' coping strategies and strengths that may be a critical resource in addressing current stressors. So here's some quick facts, information that we learned about the ACEs study done by the Children's Trust Fund and Children's Hospital in 2010. We learned that 56% of Wisconsinites that responded have at least one ACE, and 14% have experienced 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. Compared to the United States, where 64% of people nationally experienced at least one ACE, and only over 12% experienced 4 or more ACEs. So while fewer people in Wisconsin experienced at least one ACE, more people experienced 4 or more ACEs. Health, Mental health and behavioral outcomes are associated with ACEs that are related to the 10 leading causes of death in the United States. So from both a home visiting perspective as well as an overall population health perspective, it's really important to understand the experiences of families and respond to them accordingly. So here's some quick facts that will be helpful in understanding the impact of ACEs in the United States. When someone has 4 or more ACEs, they're twice as likely to smoke, twice as likely to have heart disease, twice as likely to be diagnosed with cancer, and 4 times as likely to have emphysema or chronic bronchitis. They're 6 times as likely to have sex before age 15, 7 times as likely to be alcoholics, 12 times as likely to have attempted suicide, and 46 times as likely to have injected drugs. Understanding these quick facts isn't about saying, wow, if somebody has had a childhood experience that was adverse, they're really in bad shape and it looks like the die has been cast. Rather, it's an opportunity to understand that there is a direct response to human beings, both in terms of our mental, emotional, and physical health when it comes to these experiences, and that those experiences and poor outcomes, that there's a scientific basis for it, and it's not about a personal failing. Here are some quick facts about adverse childhood experiences in families who are participating in Wisconsin's Family Foundation's home visiting program. Over 1,100 people completed the Childhood Experiences Survey. 99% of those who reported emotional neglect had an average of 6.5 ACE score on a 1 to 10 scale. So that's 6.5 on a 1 to 10 scale. 98.7% of those who reported psychological abuse had an average ACE score of 5.8 on a 1 to 10 scale. 95.9% of those who reported physical neglect had an average ACE score of 6.3, and 94.8% of those who reported sexual abuse had an average ACE score of 5.6. 94.6% of those who reported physical neglect had an average ACE score of 5.3. So part of what this information helps us to understand is that if someone has experienced one ACE, that there's a likelihood of experiencing more than one ACE, and that some adverse childhood experiences are correlated with having significantly higher ACE scores. So when we look at kind of overall within Wisconsin's Family Foundation's home visiting program and the ACEs reported, 15% of participants reported no ACE, 16.4% reported one ACE, 13.5% reported 2 ACEs, 11.4% reported 3 ACEs, 13.3% reported 4 ACEs, and 30.4% reported 5 or more ACEs. This is significantly higher than both Wisconsin and the nation's average. So here's some important things to keep in mind about adverse childhood experiences, that while they can have a significant and profound effect, that real resilience and protective factors matter. So early intervention works, and works best using a 2-generation model that addresses the needs of the parents, children, and their relationship. This is consistent with all of the evidence-based home visiting models that are being used by Wisconsin grantees. So home visiting in and of itself is an effective response to adverse childhood experiences that have been the experience of the parents participating, and also help in a promotion and prevention manner of the children who are part of the home visiting program in Wisconsin. High quality home visiting is linked to better mental health, physical health, and developmental outcomes. It's developmentally appropriate, positive, and engaging, and those experiences really matter and provide a counter to adverse childhood experiences. Comprehensive physical and behavioral health services, including but not limited to developmental screening and appropriate follow-up, a medical home, and a dental home, are critical in mitigating adverse childhood experiences. So it's important that when we talk about and think about adverse childhood experiences, that we also think about resilience and focusing on one without paying attention to the other, both as home visitors, but also with families, only tells half of the story. So when we know about a person's negative early childhood experiences, we don't really know the person. We also need to understand their sources of resilience. So there are individual capabilities, there are qualities of attachment and belonging with caring, competent people in a protective community, and there may be faith or cultural processes that provide support and well-being as a response to and a counter to adverse childhood experiences. And it's important to bear those in mind. At the end of this module, there are resources that are available to learn more about screening for resilience and to support those conversations about resiliency. So, why is it important to have this conversation with families? We know why it's important from a public health perspective. We know why it's important in some ways for professionals to understand how adverse childhood experiences are influencing a family, but it's also important to the families themselves. So when families are able to understand adverse childhood experiences, it can motivate them to create different opportunities for their own children than they themselves experienced. And in talking about adverse childhood experiences and resiliency, can allow families and home visitors to explore healthy strategies and problem solving in current life. So in order to use the Childhood Experiences Survey effectively, there are some things to keep in mind about the protocol in terms of getting started. Like all people-centered screening and assessment, it's important to be compassionate, open, flexible, conversational, and respectful when introducing and using the tool. It's important to make sure that the person completing the screen can speak freely and safely. And some ways that you might keep that in mind in a very specific way are not completing the Adverse Childhood Experiences Survey on the very first visit. So allowing there to be a buffering effect of some built trust and relationship prior to having this conversation. It's also important to make sure that there is privacy. So when you start the screen, it's important to start it early in a home visit and not save it to the end. By starting it early in a home visit, it makes sure that the screening process is conversational, unhurried, and delivered calmly. And it also allows you to take your cues from the parent rather than taking your cues from the time ticking away on your clock. It's important to explain to families that the focus of the screening will be on things that happened in their life prior to turning 18. One, to give them the sense that you're not going to be talking about experiences after 18, that it's really focused on childhood. And it's also important to let them know that it may be sensitive. If you're already aware of trauma or toxic stress in the family's history, in that parent's history, then acknowledge your awareness and explain that the screen simply ensures that you haven't overlooked something important that happened in their life. It's really difficult and challenging sometimes for families to share their story. It can also be something that's met with great relief. But when stories are shared and not acknowledged or honored, it's very problematic. So if there have already been some disclosures either through the intake process or through the home visitors' interactions with the family, it's important to acknowledge that and explain why it's still important to do the Childhood Experiences Survey. So a great way to really share power and emphasize that principle of autonomy and choice and respect and positive regard that are so critical to people-centered approaches, you can hand the family a survey and then keep a copy for yourself as well as the home visitor. Both parties then can review together, but the parent can have the space to reflect. And again, here's where it's really important, not just in the introduction, but in the administration of the survey, to really watch their cues. And if somebody needs more time to write, they can do that. The parent or the home visitor can then record the answers. It's important that there's a recorded copy in the home visitor notes that can then be entered, but it can be entered by either During the screening discussion, it's really important to normalize that past experiences from childhood have an impact on how people live and parent. And so when people understand that they are not alone in having experiences from childhood that are still present in some way today in their own family, that can be a very helpful way to reduce shame and stigma around those adverse experiences. It also gives an opportunity in the discussion to explore if and how they believe past experiences may be influencing their life today. So we can't make an assumption that there's particular things that are happening as a result of those adverse childhood experiences, but it's important to certainly have that conversation and to engage in some reflection and storytelling about that. This is a great opportunity to really hear people and where they're coming from and what their insights are, and it's also a great opportunity to exercise that accurate empathy and really let people know that not only are they sharing, but that you're hearing them. During the screening discussion, it's also important to consider discussing what things they'd like to do the same or differently from how they were raised. This is a great opportunity to reinforce some of the goal-setting work that you may be engaged in already in the home visiting process. And so by making that connection to the screening and assessment and the goals planning work and movement that you're doing together, it can be very helpful. You may also want to inquire with the person about their needs or interests for ongoing support. So it may be that while those are experiences that occurred in childhood, you may be the first person that they've had an opportunity to talk about that with. And there are trained professionals who do great work around trauma in many communities that you may be able to do a warm handoff to. So if it seems like something that is a pressing need, that's a referral process that you can make during that home visit. But if the need for services isn't immediate, but the person wants some additional support or at least to explore the possibility of additional support, they can call 211 or 1-800-422-4453 to reach a referral service or to locate local services. And once the screening has been introduced and completed, it's important to document the screening results in Sphere and any follow-up in the case notes. So there are some potential pitfalls that are important to keep in mind when delivering the Childhood Experiences Survey. One is to not make assumptions about whether people are interested or not interested in talking about and responding to a screen on childhood abuse or negative childhood experiences. In fact, in research done by Drs. Topitsits and Mirsky, we learned that 80% of women who completed the survey in Family Foundation's home visiting programs said that they were not at all or only slightly uncomfortable with completing the survey. And only 4% of those who completed the survey reported feeling extremely uncomfortable. So, this is a really helpful piece of information and important to consider in a couple of ways. One, it may be that 80% of people experiencing no discomfort or only slight discomfort is really suggestive of the quality of relationship that home visitors have been able to establish with families. So there is something to be said for having meaningful conversations about sensitive topics that are having an influence in one's childhood and maybe influencing their lives into adulthood with a caring, compassionate person. So this says a lot about the ability of home visitors to frame the Childhood Experiences Survey in a way that puts families at ease and sends that message of acceptance. In terms of some strategies that work, again, keeping in mind that not introducing the Childhood Experiences Survey at the first home visiting meeting is important. And then with those 4% that reported feeling extremely uncomfortable, it's just important when one's noticing that discomfort to try to understand what the discomfort is about and to provide the emotional support or have the problem-solving discussion about why the screen is being used and how it may be helpful. Another pitfall to avoid is to avoid just handing a mom or another parent the screen and saying, please fill this out. So it's really important that the screen happens in the context of a supportive relationship, and that's part of how home visitors have been so successful, in that I know over 80% of women completing it being comfortable or only slightly uncomfortable. And then the other important thing to keep in mind is that you shouldn't wait until you're entering the data into Sphere to determine if it's a positive or negative screen, and to have that follow-up conversation. So if somebody shares information with you during a home visit as they complete the Childhood Experiences survey, it's important to not just move on from it like it's paperwork that's been completed or a task that's been completed. It's important to use that information in a relational way and have a conversation about what the person who completed it thinks it means, and also what additional follow-up may be in order. So there's some real value of completing the Childhood Experiences survey, not only for the family but also for the home visitor, and it can really strengthen the home visiting process. By completing the Childhood Experiences survey earlier in a relationship, again not at the first visit, it allows the home visitor and the parent or guardian to really understand and reflect together about where the parent's coming from and what their point of view is. It may strengthen the home visitor-parent partnership when sensitive conversations are handled in a respectful, collaborative, and authentic way. It sends that message loud and clear to families that the relationship that home visitors and families are developing is strong enough to be able to hold important stuff, such as childhood experiences. So that's an important message to send, and that's an important pattern to establish early to have a strong working alliance and maintain family engagement. Related to goal setting, talking about childhood experiences and completing the Childhood Experiences survey can uncover motivations for family goals. So if you understand a family's trauma history and their sources of resilience, it provides insight into their parenting goals. It also provides understanding about the lived experiences that parents and families have, and it allows home visitors to make sense of barriers that may arise in the movement towards completing goals. It's also helpful when home visitors understand that because of those adverse early childhood experiences, the family's procedural memories about being parented may be different from their intentions around how they would like to parent. And it also provides some insight about educational strategies that might be used. So oftentimes if somebody has experienced significant trauma and doesn't have positive procedural memories to draw from, providing information alone will not change parenting practices or strengthen parenting practices. But coaching and support and reflection can be very helpful additional strategies than typical straightforward didactic educational strategies. So this gives some insight to home visitors about ways that they can approach supporting parents around different family goals. So it's important when introducing the survey, as we mentioned, the protocol, to really present it to families in a way that emphasizes the usefulness to the family. So this survey can really be a valuable strategy in supporting a family's motivation to make positive changes. So when someone reflects on their experiences, if those experiences were great and they have no adverse childhood experiences, then it can be that lovely reminder that family life can be really good and healthy and strong, and something that they continue to build on in their own immediate family with their own children. And for participants for whom their childhood experiences included at least one ACE or more, it can be a motivating factor to make and maintain positive changes in their own life in order to give their children some of the things that they want their children to have that they themselves may not have experienced. So by tending to a family's needs for compassion and openness and transparency and autonomy during the childhood experiences screening process, you can really strengthen their motivation to change. So while the following slides will have information for home visitors about key ways that you might frame and address particular needs when you introduce the Childhood Experiences Survey, these talking points are not intended to be memorized and committed to rote recitation. In fact, they're suggestions, and there may be particular phrases or words that really make sense and resonate for you, and you may also use this as an opportunity in the modules to jot down some phrases that you already use or that you would like to use to be more intentional about introducing the Childhood Experiences Survey. So, as with all screening and assessment, it's important to let families know that you're not singling them out for this screen. There isn't something about them in particular that triggered you asking these questions. In fact, it lets them know that there is a reason behind asking the screening and assessment. So here's a suggestion and a way that you might frame it. And again, I encourage you to think of ways that you want to frame it or are already framing it yourself. We ask these questions to all families we work with because often what parents experience in their own childhood can influence what happens or how they feel when they raise children of their own. And so together we're going to explore some of your childhood experiences before you were 18 so I understand where you're coming from, and also so we can look together about how that might be a part of your life today in terms of the choices that you're making as a parent. It's also helpful to really convey compassion and to really get to some of people's emotional or heartfelt needs. And so one way to introduce the screen in that way or to present the screen in that way is to say that sometimes what people experience in childhood can impact their own beliefs and parenting practices. So I'll be asking you questions that some people find uncomfortable and others are glad to talk about. And as we begin the survey and go through the survey, please let me know how you're doing. And if at any point we need to stop and check in or there's something that I can do to support you to make it more comfortable, let me know. It's also important in our messaging around the screening and assessment to be really open and clear. And some people really want to, and rightfully so, are thinking in a very critical and reflective way about what they're being asked to do in a home visiting process. And so if more clarity is warranted or more openness is needed in addition to the compassion and the normalizing that it's done with everybody, here's another suggestion. You can say, we ask these questions to all families we work with because often what parents experience in their own childhood can influence what happens or how they feel when they raise children of their own. By better understanding what's going on or what happened in your life, we can better work together so you can meet your goals. It's also really important to keep families in the driver's seat. That idea of really emphasizing that people-centered and motivational interviewing principle of autonomy. And so a way to do that is to say, I'm going to go through some questions with you about difficult experiences you may or may not have had before you turned 18. Please feel free to skip any question you prefer not to answer or ask what a question means. So, if you have consent to move forward with the screen, that's important. But in addition to that, it's important that even though people have said yes to the screen, they know that they have the option to skip or clarify any question. So now that we've thought about ways to frame the Childhood Experiences Survey to families in ways that are supportive and helpful, let's also take an opportunity to look at a few videos. In the videos, you'll see 3 different parts. The first video will really focus on introducing the screening tool. The second video will really focus on some of the questions in the screening tool. And the final video will be an opportunity to look at how to do appropriate follow-up and conversation about the screening process. After each video, there'll be an opportunity for you to reflect and write down some ideas you have about your own approach and what was working and not working in the videos that you saw.
So, Sophia, today we have 3 things that I'm hoping that we can cover together. One, I always want to check in on how things are going with your goals and what's going on for you and your family. We also have another assessment today. Today it's the Childhood Experiences survey, where we'll kind of take back a look at your life from 18 and younger. And then the third thing that we want to do is just check in on how things are going with the follow-up around the screening that we did last week with baby Jordan. Do you have a preference for which one we do first?
Honestly, I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm not exactly sure, because I know you're talking about childhood experience, what that has to do with parenting now.
Yeah. So the Childhood Experiences survey looks back at different things that happened in your life before you turned 18. And the things that it's specifically looking at is the things that were stressful or things that were traumatic. And what we've learned over time is that what people experience in childhood can have a big impact on how they parent themselves. And sometimes making those connections can help us just make more sense of our life and our world. And we do this survey with everybody because we know that that's not just true for a few families, that's true for many families. And so we do it with all home visiting families. Does that answer your question, or is there more I can explain?
Yeah, I guess that makes sense.
All right. So given that, do you want to do that first, or do you want to wait and do that later in our visit?
I think I'd like to start out with that.
Okay, that sounds good.
All right, time to reflect on video 1. What were some of the strengths of how the Childhood Experiences survey screen was introduced? Did you see any people-centered approaches that were particularly effective? Were there examples of affirmations that were either about really recognizing somebody's autonomy to answer the questions or not, or to participate or not? Were there any examples of really conveying that accurate empathy? Were there times where it was clear that the home visitor was trying to take on and understand the worldview of the parent? And were there times where it was very, very clear that that warmth and that conversational style were in place? As you're considering whether or not those elements are in place, you might also think about what you would add to strengthen how the Childhood Experiences survey is offered.
All right then, so there are 19 questions, like I said, and we'll just go through them one by one. So the first one's really looking at financial stuff. As a child, how often did your family experience serious financial problems? Would you say that was never, rarely, sometimes, often, or very often?
I would say very often.
Okay. And then you also said, the next question says, how often were you hungry because your family couldn't afford food? Would you say that that was never, rarely, sometimes, often, or very often?
Probably sometimes.
Mm-hmm. And how often were you homeless when you were growing up? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, very often?
Never.
All right. The next question on the second page is really just kind of looking a little bit more at your relationships.
Okay.
So how often did a parent or an adult in your home swear at you, insult you, or put you down?
Probably very rarely.
Okay. So the options are never or rarely. Is it more of a 1 or more of a 2 for you?
I would say more of a 2.
Okay. And how often were you bullied or severely teased by other children or adolescents?
Often.
Okay. The next question looks at, before you were 18, how often was there an adult in your household who tried hard to make sure your basic needs were met? Like food, shelter?
Most of the time.
So 4. Awesome. And how often was there an adult in your household who made you feel safe and protected?
Always.
Maybe. Before age 18, how often did a parent or an adult in your home ever hit, beat, kick, or physically hurt you in any way?
Never.
Okay. And then the next looks at how often did your parents or an adult in your home ever slap, hit, beat, kick, or physically hurt each other?
More than once.
It happened more than once?
Yeah.
And so, probably that 3?
Yeah.
Okay.
I would say.
How often did an adult or anyone at least 5 years older than you touch you sexually or try to make you touch them sexually or force you to have sex?
Never.
And did you live with anyone who was depressed, mentally ill, or suicidal?
No.
Okay. Did you live with anyone who was a problem drinker or an alcoholic?
Yes.
Okay. And did you live with anyone who used illegal street drugs or who abused prescription meds?
No.
Okay. It's more of the alcohol.
Right.
Yep. And did you live with anyone who served time or was sentenced to serve time in prison, jail, or a correctional facility?
No.
Okay. Excellent. And were your parents separated or divorced?
No, not until later on.
Okay, was it after 18 or before 18?
Probably right before I turned 18.
Okay. So, well, you had a whole childhood with them together towards the end of your childhood?
Mostly.
Okay, all right. Was either one of your parents absent from your life for a long period of time, not including absences due to death?
No.
Okay, so you really had both of them around?
Yeah. Yes, I did.
And before age 18, did you experience the death of a parent, caregiver, or sibling?
No.
Okay. Before age 18, were you ever the victim of a violent crime? So that's any kind of violent act that was perpetrated against you by someone other than a parent or a household member?
Yes, going back to that relationship I was in, that was during high school.
Okay. And overall, how uncomfortable did you feel answering the questions or the survey that we went through just now?
Not too much. I guess maybe slightly.
Slightly, so it's not the not at all, but it wasn't a little bit or very, okay. Excellent. Do you have any questions for me about the questions we went through?
Not that I can think of.
Okay. So,
In this final video, we're asking you to reflect on how did the home visitor send the message to the parent or guardian that the survey was more than a required exercise or paperwork? And what kind of follow-up do the parent or guardian and home visitor each need to do, if any, based on the responses to the Childhood Experiences survey? Please also consider how the information learned in this survey would influence how a home visitor works with this parent or guardian. Please take a moment to jot down a few ideas. So there are some reflective exercises that can be really helpful to home visitors when they are doing work around childhood experiences. And taking time and making time for the positive can be very, very important to maintain the well-being of the home visitor. So there are some really specific things that you can do to process through the stories that you're hearing as you're completing home visits and engaging in authentic conversations. One strategy is to talk one-on-one or as a group with your supervisor or colleagues about how you define success with a family. Little steps can make a big difference in building engagement, trust, and a strong working alliance. So recognize high-quality engagement and appreciate it when it happens. Notice why it's working, and also be open to noticing what creates barriers. Identify a family strength or many family strengths, and ask families to identify their family strengths. Put it on a Post-it note in their file and remember it. Use it as a place to reflect during hard visits. Another reflective exercise is to consider the power of happiness and resilience. So there are some videos, talks, and articles that may provide a good conversation starter during a staff meeting or to make space for what can be done to support well-being. So we know that there is research out there that's uncovered the fact that happiness is surprisingly contagious. So psychologist James H. Fowler, he studied the data of 5,000 people over 20 years and found that happiness benefits other people through 3 degrees. And that the effects last for at least a year. He says, we found a statistical relationship, not just between your happiness and your friend's happiness, but between your happiness and your friend's happiness. So please bear in mind as you're working on things that are really difficult that it's even that much more important to be having conversations about the strengths of families, about your strengths as a home visiting program and a home visiting team, and to be intentionally creating positive or uplifting experiences. So if you want to know more about the work that Dr. Fowler did, you can go to this PBS link. There's also a great resource. It's called Flow, The Secret to Happiness. It's a TED Talk. It's short, sweet, interesting. If you love YouTube videos of kids who are super happy, you might get a kick out of Jessica's affirmation. And there's also a great YouTube video on validation. And while it's validation by somebody who is in a very different professional role from home visitors, there are some interesting, surprising, and fun parallels. So these may be useful pieces to respond and react to as a home visiting team. So let's think more about some of the specific things that supervisors can do to really support the work around screening for childhood experiences as well as follow-up. So it's really important to pay attention to a workplace environment, and I know that that's something that is in the hearts and minds of home visiting supervisors across Wisconsin. And so one way to maintain environment is about the emotional environment. So by supporting formal and informal dialogue and debriefing, both by providing time for that as well as being open to providing that oneself, it really sets the tone that it is normal, expected, and good to be reflecting on what's happening during home visits. It's also important to have policies and practices in place for weekly or biweekly reflective supervision, and to really honor that time by being prepared and being in the moment and not using that as an opportunity for administrative supervision. So by making sure that these practices are in place, it gives an opportunity for people to take what they're learning by asking questions in the Childhood Experiences survey and to unpackage that in a way that is safe, healthy, and good, and allows the home visitor to go back fresh and present with the families that they work with. And reflective supervision and reflective practice is not only helpful for direct line staff, it's also very helpful for supervisors to be receiving that themselves. Another way that you can create that healthy workplace environment that makes it possible to be resilient to working with and hearing about families' trauma is to have an effective on-call system so that home visitors have an accessible resource person if a crisis emerges during a visit. It's important to have clear policies and practices in place to promote healthy boundaries and ethical practices. So in addition to routine reflective practice, it's also important that the infrastructure is in place to help guide and provide reassurance to home visitors about where those professional boundaries lie and what's expected in terms of ethical action. Creating time in the office where staff see one another so that they can check in and support one another is really important, not just in the context of all staff meetings, but in other ways as well. And so having real intention around how people's schedules are set, so that way there's built-in formal and informal opportunities to connect and provide support is essential. And the other thing that can really go a long way to create a workplace environment that makes it more likely that people can stay purpose-driven and effective in their home visiting practices to really celebrate the strengths of all staff and taking time to acknowledge and honor when people handle difficult situations with grace and with respect and honesty. So that way that supervisors notice strengths and really speak to and build on the positives can go a long way to creating a place where dealing with difficult work is something that's doable and sustainable. Related to that workplace environment is also really promoting self-care. So not only are there organizational practices that can be in place in terms of being intentional about building a work environment and work culture, it's also important to really consider how policies, procedures, and practices are promoting self-care. One way that programs can do this is by really evaluating paid time off policies and considering, does the paid time off that's currently afforded allow sufficient time for staff to relax, to rejuvenate, and to maintain work-life balance. And if having this discussion and in doing this review, teams discover that really because of the intensity of work that there may be different policies or approaches that are needed, then it's important just to consider that and to be real with the home visiting team about what's possible and what's not, and what the timelines around those possibilities are. So another strategy to really consider is what happens when people do take paid time off. And so does the time away really mean time away? Or teams need to ask themselves, are people regularly contacted on their days off? And then consider developing an on-call rotation so that way time off can really be honored. So that way people know that when they're away they can really be off, but that there's somebody else that they can connect with to get support if they need it. Evaluating compensation policies can be really important. And you may be wondering, why would we talk about compensation policies when we're talking about self-care? And one of the things I'd like you to consider as part of the parallel process is that, if there are home visitors who are dealing with families that are having significant stressors around their financial well-being, and the home visitor themselves is having significant challenges around financial well-being, it may be hard to provide support around that without being triggered. So, are the stressors of challenging caseloads being intensified by the stressors of meeting financial obligations with low wages? If that's the case, that combination really can lead to high turnover rates and burnout rates. By completing regular salary studies and making sure that compensation is competitive with industry standards, it can give supervisors and agencies the reminder and the affirmation that they're doing what's best practice to maintain highly qualified and well cared for members of a team. If in those compensation studies you learn that there's a significant difference between where your current practices are and where the industry practices are, then it can be a real opportunity to look at how to remedy that. There are free tools available such as payscale.com that provide free wage and benefit comparisons, but you can also put salary or compensation evaluation into a Google search bar and find other tools as well to compare wages and benefits within an industry. So another really helpful thing to do around promoting self-care is to have regular check-ins about boundaries that recognize the nuances and difficulty of negotiating boundaries with colleagues and with families. By having that be an intentional and routine part of conversations and check-ins, it honors the fact that those issues can get really tricky in work that is as challenging and as meaningful as home visiting. So another way that supervisors can really support success is about using data as a source of celebration. So sphere analysis can inform supervisors when benchmarks around screening are being met and provide opportunities to celebrate progress and success related to completing screens on time. It's important to, in those celebrations, to not only honor why that's exciting in terms of meeting contract obligations or job performance standards, but to celebrate why that's important in terms of really learning more about families, strengthening practices, and supporting families toward better outcomes. Another way that you can use data is to spot check SPEAR screening results for childhood experience, is it can give real insight into the complexity of someone's caseload. If one home visitor has a caseload with a few reported ACEs and another has a caseload with the majority of mothers with a score of 4 or more, it would give a supervisor the ability to consider what additional supports the home visitor that has the more intense caseload may need in order that they're able to continue to successfully individualize services for higher need families. So in order for them to meet that intensity of need, they may need additional supervisory support. So becoming trauma-informed is really important in helping home visitors and supervisors continue to do work around the Childhood Experiences Survey in a productive and thoughtful way. We're not asking that home visitors step outside of their scope of practice and engage in intense work around trauma, but we are noticing that it's really important that the home visitor and their supervisor have a solid understanding of how trauma is interplaying with the work that they're doing in home visiting. So being a trauma-informed program is not simply a matter of professional development and awareness of trauma-informed practices. Those are essential, but they're not sufficient. Becoming trauma-informed is really an ongoing process of practice, reflection, and attention to outcomes. And by thinking about trauma in these ways, in this systematic and ongoing way, it really creates an environment where it's acceptable and it's good to be paying attention to both the impacts of trauma on families and as well as the impacts of secondary or vicarious trauma. But being trauma-informed really requires addressing the needs and interests of the people being served as well as the people delivering services, so really holding both as important. There are some specific things that supervisors can do when recruiting home visitors to identify and select and recruit and then maintain people who can approach the Childhood Experiences Survey and conversations that are of a more sensitive nature in a good way. So during the interview process, it's important to tell candidates that part of this job involves asking questions about a parent's or guardian's early childhood experiences with trauma and toxic stress. So let those potential home visitors know that disclosures are not uncommon. Remember, the rates of 5 or more adverse childhood experiences in Wisconsin are higher than the national average. And they're also higher than the state average. Another strategy that you might consider is giving candidates a few minutes to review the Childhood Experiences Survey and then ask them to role-play administering the survey during the interview. Again, you're not looking for perfection and flow with the Childhood Experiences Survey. What you're really looking for is to see if there is some comfort in approaching a sensitive topic and to see if there are some examples of those motivational interviewing adherence skills or those people-centered approaches that send the right messages to families. In addition to having that frank conversation and doing a role play, some sample interview questions might include the following. Question 1. If someone responds to a survey that they experienced several traumatic or stressful childhood situations, how might you use that information to help you deliver home visiting services? Another question that you might consider is question number 2. If someone talked about a negative childhood experience that was similar to an experience of your own, what would you do? And so in these questions, you're really wanting to understand people's ability to reflect, to think critically, to seek support from their colleagues and their supervisor appropriately. Another really important way to support home visiting staff in delivering childhood experience surveys in an effective way goes back to the very beginning, and once you've recruited staff, to really orient those new staff effectively. So sharing information with the potential new staff about the prevalence of ACEs in your agency's caseload is helpful. If that data isn't readily available, sharing information with them from the 2015 benchmarks report can be very useful to give them some context for what's happening in families in your community. It's important to point out, or to at least have that conversation, that the number of adverse childhood experiences are in fact higher in home visiting families. In addition to understanding how frequently it happens, it's also important to describe the impacts of adverse childhood experiences on physical, behavioral, mental, and economic well-being. by describing those impacts and showing that that's a trend that's not just true in individuals in particular, but that that's something that is a common outcome for many people who've experienced adverse childhood experiences, we can really move away from a situation that forgets that people were once children and came into adulthood with experiences that impact the way they address things as adults. So rather than a blame the victim kind of approach, it gives that more of a perspective of context. And that can be very helpful in home visiting in terms of maintaining that unconditional positive regard rather than reverting to a place of judgment that can happen when home visitors are hearing very stressful things and seeing stressful practices frequently in families. It's also important to understand what professional development experiences a new hire has around adverse childhood experiences and identify additional opportunities for training. So contacting the UW-Milwaukee Child Welfare Training Partnership may be a way to see if there's anything that's being offered by them, or they're very involved with the professional development community in Wisconsin and may have ideas about other ways to get access to training. So it's also important to introduce new staff to people in the community who work on trauma issues, so that way if they do need to make a referral, that they're able to do that with some confidence about who they're doing the referral to. It kind of makes it more of a warm handoff. It can also be helpful to share and review the childhood experiences tip sheets, which are available at the end of this module. Those can be used both by new home visitors or with current home visitors who are expressing discomfort with administering the childhood experiences survey. During orientation, there should be ample opportunities to role play with a supervisor or colleagues, because the first time using this survey should not be with a home visiting family. So by providing those multiple opportunities for role plays and conducting the survey, if you do that within the first 90 days, you're going to really help people get off to a good start and feel confident in their ability to successfully serve families. And then again, in terms of orientation, letting staff know that they can be supported if the conversations that come up during the survey are difficult. So sometimes people are so eager to show that they are excited about their job and are doing their job well that they may feel like they need to go it alone, and really normalizing that all staff need to have conversations sometimes about cases that they find challenging, that that's normal, that that's acceptable, and that that's good, really sets the tone in that orientation process. So overall, whether it's new staff or existing staff, it's really important to support a reflective approach. Discussing feelings and reactions to administering the childhood experiences survey with home visitors during staff meetings or during one-on-one supervision is really important. And when those conversations come up, really listening to those feelings without judgment is very supportive, because people can have very complex reactions to doing this work. It's also important to explore if any of the reflective exercises or other reflective activities might help process the delivery of the survey. The supervisor and home visitor can consider together the implications of the survey results on service delivery and add additional ideas to case notes if that's helpful to the home visitor in terms of being able to go back and provide helpful services to the family. This is also another reflective strategy, is to identify staff who are really comfortable and effective in delivering and discussing the survey and pair them with colleagues to practice. So it's an opportunity to really identify the strengths of the team and encourage people to work together to serve families as best as possible. So in addition to the reflective responsibilities that supervisors also have an administrative and quality assurance role when it comes to the childhood experiences survey. So monitoring the completion of the survey by using the home visiting data collection table can really make sure that timelines and expectations are being met, and that you can have confidence that all families are getting quality services. By monitoring that documentation of screening results in SPHERE at least quarterly for newly enrolled families, and in an ongoing way for families who identified childhood experiences and the need for follow-up, it can give confidence to both the supervisor and the home visitor that that the childhood experiences survey is providing meaning and guidance to the home visiting. In addition, by analyzing the data to see if there are any trends in completion rates or documentation and follow-up and family outcomes, it provides the supervisor an opportunity to provide additional support and professional development and coaching to folks who may be having a more challenging time with this survey but haven't given that feedback directly to their boss. Looking at the data can also be another feedback loop about the home visitor's experiences using this tool. So there are some great resources that are available about adverse childhood experiences. There's a video and articles available at this Robert Wood Johnson website. There's also some great tools to support resilience for parents, providers, and communities available at resiliencetrumps.aces.org. More information about the National ACE Study is available at the acestudy.org website. And then if people want to learn more about ACEs in Wisconsin, they can see the report available online. If you have any questions about this module or about information herein or additional resources, please feel free to contact Lily via email, LinkedIn, her website, or phone.